Hey everyone, it's Rick, and thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. I'm in my neighborhood again. It's a little bit warmer today. I don't have to wear all the winter attire, but still winter. I wanted to continue our conversation from last time where we were looking at how easy it is for conflict to be managed with conflict, and to take a little bit of a different angle to that, but kind of reinforce how we either unwittingly do it or even in an organized way try to promote solutions to conflict with approaches that, when you look at them closely, again, reinforce the underlying elements that are responsible for conflict, and that is division, and the way we are always creating fragments that contradict each other, that we interpret one way or another, it doesn't align, and so there's a misalignment and we have conflict that's either overt or in our heads. So let's take a look at that, and I'm going to give you just a scenario, and would invite you, while I'm sharing mine, to think of corollaries in your everyday life where this plays out. So I'll start with an example where, with teenage kids, eventually they get their driver's license, and you have a new driver, 16 years old, and they're all excited to be in their car driving independent. And you basically say, well, yes, you can drive to school, and you'll have access on weekends to be with your friends, but there's a curfew at 10. You have to be home by 10. And immediately there's pushback, because your child goes, why not midnight? I'm grown up. I should be able to stay out longer. And you just go, no, it's 10 o'clock. And, you can't reason with them because they, are not quite reasonable yet. And you basically just say, it's the way it is, and let's just agree to disagree. And so that's your first step, right? Your first step for conflict management here is, we're doing it my way, and we'll just agree to disagree. So think about how that plays out in other scenarios in, politics or family relations, where there's just one opinion versus another on how to do something or how we view the world. And we start out by just saying, let's agree to disagree, and we sort of set up a tolerance for different points of views and perspectives. And then we have sort of a progression from there, where with my child again, so they put up with sort of the curfew at 10 for a time, and then again they start to push, and they start to say, I'm 17 now, or I'm almost 18, and nobody is home. I'm the only one that has to go home by 10 if I have the car. And so you kind of start to look at that and you go, okay, well, let's compromise. I still think you should be home early. Your child says, I want to be home at midnight, and the compromise is, all right, we'll say 11 o'clock. And again, there's still a differing of opinions, but you find the middle ground where basically neither one is really happy with the result, but it again creates sort of a period of stability among the differences, right? So, again, you can think of other scenarios in your lives where you're compromising, where you go, I think this at work, somebody else says, I think we should do that, and you say, all right, let's find the middle ground, right? So we compromise. And then, the next step with the driving scenario is you get to a point where that compromise is no longer acceptable. And again, they're a little bit older, maybe they're a little bit more responsible with their driving, at least according to them. And, and then they basically say, okay, let's negotiate. Let's say if I can, stay out till midnight again, I will, do some additional things for you around the house, or I'll go run groceries, or, I'll pick up my younger siblings if they need a ride. And so you get into a scenario again where it's not exactly what you want, but at the end of the day you say, okay, so you give me this, I'll give you that. And we land in a space where, again, we have sort of a moment of tolerance, peace. Peace is probably not even the right word. It's mostly just tolerance. And that goes on for a while. And, it's now 11:30. And then, that goes on for a while. And then, as is typical with your 18-year-old teenager, or it starts far before then, but now they sort of start to push boundaries and they say, I'm going to test the 11:30. And so they start to basically exceed their curfew, if you will. So, typical conversation in my house was, I'm leaving at 11:30. So, please let me be home by, 10 to midnight. And, and all the other parents are allowing their kids to do that. Why can't we? And we go, well, we're not their parents. And, our points of view are sounding a little bit different to your friend's parents. And we don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what we say. So we go from negotiation to saying, all right, I'll tell you what. My brother has older kids, and we'll let him weigh in, and we'll come with our different points of view, perspectives, and we'll share it with him, and we'll let him decide for us. So we go to mediation, right? So now we have somebody that we basically say, I'm going to tell you my side of the story, or my interpretation. They're going to tell their interpretation, and our agreement is we will do what you advise us to do. Okay. So again, think of where we use mediation, relationships, divorce, separation, all those things as examples. Mediators in business disputes, right? Somebody comes in, they'll decide for us. And so, my brother comes in and says, well, why don't you just make it 11:45 and say they have to leave by 11:30? Let's just make that okay. So we go, okay, fine. And, again, there's sort of a loose agreement that that's what we're going to do. And then, ultimately, again, we get sort of a period of quiet, if you will, non-dispute. And then, something extreme happens. We're going to bed because it's past our bedtime. And lo and behold, your child comes home after midnight without, really any kind of preamble warning. They just basically say, I'm going to just stay out till midnight and see what happens. And then you're basically at a point where you go, okay, you just crossed a line there, and, game over, if you will. And now we're back in sort of full-blown conflict where we basically say, you don't get the car on the weekends. And, now we have moved to basically coming up with guidelines, again, because there will always be, in addition to something like that, some excuse, if you will, where they say, well, I don't remember that being 11:45. I remember it being midnight. And so what do you do then? Well, you say, okay, now we're going to write this down and you're going to have to sign something. And so that's legislation, right? Policy is now we set this in stone to basically formalize this and say, if this happens, here are very clear guidelines as to what you can and cannot do, and there are consequences, and here they are. Sign this, right? And so that's an extreme example in, say, child driving, but sometimes it ends up in elements like that. So again, there are plenty of other examples in real life where we're legislating and setting policy rules because without them, people don't follow guidelines. So think about all of that. So what's the point? So we have sort of this escalation from, all the steps that we talked about, from, tolerance, agreeing to disagree, to compromise, to negotiation, to mediation, to legislation. And for every single one of those steps, you can kind of look at the fundamental problem and say, have we resolved conflict in any of those? And, when you really look at it closely, is all we're doing is we're treating symptoms. And really not even addressing and understanding what the fundamental source of difference is that's creating all of this, and having really no common ground for making any of these decisions because we're all coming from our own interpretations. So again, you can kind of see that if we have division creates conflict, we've looked at that. And if your solution involves division or preserves division, regardless of how it may seem, the conflict is always simmering underneath whatever the, superficial, symptomatic inputs are created. So again, you can just kind of see how our approach to conflict really doesn't solve conflict. It really becomes a management of symptoms. So what we're really doing is managing. And pretty much any intervention, if you look at it closely, for conflict resolution is the management of the symptoms of conflict rather than actually an understanding of the core elements that are creating the conflict to begin with. And if you don't have a shared understanding of that, and you see that in problem solving every day, also in quality improvement and anything else that's sort of what we formally call problem solving, that's what happens. So that's it for today. Think about, again, sort of that fundamental premise that division creates conflict, and solutions to conflict that have division preserved or division included as part of the solution really do very little to solve any conflicts as far as elimination is concerned. It's mostly just management. So next time we'll start to look at, why do we do that? And, it seems so obvious, I think, when you start to look at it. Why is it our common practice? Have a great day, a great week, and I look forward to our next Walkabout. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.